Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Je suis Boris Proulx, journaliste au journal Le Devoir et je serai le modérateur. Nous avons aujourd'hui plusieurs ministres et députés au Parlement. So we have many ministers, member of parliaments, among others, David Lametti, ministre de la Justice et procureur général du Canada, and Marci Ien, Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth. Et plusieurs autres, je vous laisserai vous présenter en temps et lieu. Nous allons prendre des questions dans la salle, puis sur Zoom. We'll take questions first in the room and then on Zoom after a few quick remarks on that. Ministers, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Bonjour, mon nom c'est Emmanuel Dubourg, je suis le député de Bourassa, au Québec. Merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui à l'occasion de l'annonce d'un financement pour cette importante initiative. Thank you for joining us today's announcement on this important initiative. I acknowledge with gratitude that we are holding this press conference on the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples. Today, we have with us Honorable Marci Ien, Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth, the Honorable Member Ahmed Hussen, Minister of Housing, Diversity and Inclusion, Honorable David Lametti, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and I'd like to say that we have with us the MP Gary Annan-Sengria with us, and we also have Dr. Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, Canada's Black Justice Strategy Steering Group member and author, and Associate Professor of the Department of Sociology of the University of Toronto, and also Mrs. Zilla Jones, Canada's Black Justice Strategy Steering Group member and author and human rights lawyer. We will have the opportunity to hear a short opening remarks from each of our guests. Then we will go to Q&A. And now I'd like to turn over Minister Marci Ien, who will say a few words. So, ministers, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Emmanuel. Hello, bonjour. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today during Black History Month. And thank you so much again to Emmanuel and Ahmed and David and Gary for all of your amazing, amazing work, and the steering committee members who are here with us today. I have to tell you that it was just 3 years ago, May it will be 3 years, that the world was shaken by the murder of George Floyd. And for me, on a very personal note, it was a driver to get involved in politics. At that time, I was thinking, how could I serve better? What more could I do? For others, this was a painful awakening to the realities of systemic racism, to the realities of anti-Black racism, a reality that Black communities across this great country of ours know all too well. So when it happened, many were quick to point out that it happened outside of our country. But with a simple search online, you will see that similar incidents have happened right here in Canada. In Toronto Centre, the riding that I proudly represent, I see cycles of violence and injustice repeat themselves. Families broken apart by the criminal justice system and young people falling victim to their hostile environments. As one local educator said, quote, "You see community members, kids, going through this all the time. Trauma after trauma. It never gets fixed. It never gets to heal properly." We also see this in the statistics that show Black people accounted for 6% of all accused, while representing just 3% of the Canadian population, and are 36% more likely to receive a long-term sentence of 2 years or more. These stories paint the grim reality of Black Canadian experiences within the criminal justice system, and these stories are the reason moms like me, right across the country, have to have really difficult conversations with their kids. More specifically, our sons. So this brings us to why today's announcement is so very important and why equity programs and policies are so, so important. This is not, and I repeat, not about preferential treatment of one group over another. This is about looking at the data that is right in front of us. It's about seeing those gaps and changing these systems to make sure that these cycles don't continue. The other important piece of this is creating solutions by community for community. And that is exactly what the steering community will do, with its 9 members from Black communities right across this country, representing diverse backgrounds as well as expertise. Their advice comes from their own combined experiences and frontline work, grassroots work, discussions with experts and community leaders. Their work will identify ways to reform and modernize the criminal justice system to make sure that everyone has access to fair and just treatment before the law. Je tiens à remercier les membres du comité directeur dont deux sont parmi nous aujourd'hui d'avoir entrepris cet important travail. Professor Owusu-Bempah, Ms. Jones, thank you for being with us here today for this important announcement, and also for taking on the role of co-authors of the steering group's final report. We appreciate that. This strategy is one of many ways that we're making concrete systemic change. We're tackling anti-Black racism through an economic and social lens as well, through the Black Entrepreneurship Fund to start or grow businesses, the Black Philanthropic Endowment Fund to create a sustainable source of funding for Black-led and Black-serving nonprofit organizations, and investing in culturally relevant, because that's so important, mental health supports. This, folks, is what a multi-pronged approach looks like. This, frankly, is what progress looks like. Before I pass the mic, I want to say once again, Happy Black History Month to everyone, and I look forward to seeing the committee's work unfold over the coming months. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. À toi, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Minister Ien. Thank you for your remarks also. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to pass the mic to my honorable colleague, Minister Hussen. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Emmanuel. Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Today's announcement is a historic first step towards making Canada's Black Justice Strategy a reality. And I really want to thank Minister Lametti and his team for getting us to this step. You know, living the Black experience in Canada is one thing. Comprehending it and really understanding it is a whole totally different thing. I think back to when I was younger, growing up in Regent Park, and the many times I was stopped by police and asked at a time when I was just minding my own business, going for a walk, knowing that I did nothing wrong, and being asked, "Where are you going? What are you doing? What's in your pockets?" and show us your ID. And somehow, for some reason, I was seen as a threat. And at the time, I wasn't seen as just another young man walking down the street minding their own business. And I can tell you how that makes you feel when that becomes part of almost your daily experience. My experience is one that I know is all too familiar, unfortunately, for far too many of our fellow citizens. It's not right, and it is certainly not just. And sometimes it leads to tragic consequences. And that's why Canada's Black Justice Strategy is so important to embark on. Today's announcement of Canada's Black Justice Strategy Steering Group is an important one because it acknowledges that the lived experiences of so many of our fellow citizens, Black Canadian communities from across the country, are not only valid, but that they're real, and that it needs to change. This group, made up of diverse Black voices from our country, from coast to coast to coast, will help guide our government's work to find solutions to the disproportionately negative impacts that are felt by Black Canadian communities across this country when they interact with our criminal justice system. And I can't thank this group enough for the work that they're embarking on. It is very much needed, and we know the difference that they will make. L'annonce d'aujourd'hui concernant le groupe de direction de la stratégie judiciaire pour les Noirs du Canada est importante, car elle reconnaît que nos expériences vécues en tant que personnes noires au Canada sont valables et qu'elles doivent changer. Ces groupes composés de diverses voix de Noirs de partout du pays aidera à orienter le travail de notre gouvernement pour trouver des solutions aux expériences négatives disproportionnées que vivent les communautés noires du Canada avec le système de justice pénale. Je ne saurais trop les remercier pour le travail qu'ils entreprennent. Today is an important day for Canada and for Canadians because with this important step, we will take the necessary steps in conjunction and partnership and collaboration with Black Canadians from coast to coast to coast to make our criminal justice system better. And I look forward to the important work that the steering committee will do as part of our joint efforts across government to build a more equitable and just society. So thank you for everything that you do, and thank you, Minister, and your team for getting us here. And I look forward to the work of the steering committee. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Thank you so much, Minister Hussen. Et maintenant, Mesdames, Messieurs, je voudrais céder la parole au ministre de la Justice pour cette stratégie extrêmement importante. Donc, l'honorable David Lametti, à vous la parole.
Merci, Emmanuel. Hello, bonjour. Emmanuel, je tiens à te remercier pour ton dévouement et ton travail. J'apprécie énormément ta présence ici aujourd'hui. Thank you, Marci. As always, you have framed this issue so passionately and so well. And again, thank you for being here. Ahmed, you bring your voice, your calm voice, and your vast lived experience on this critical issue. And again, thank you for being here. I also want to thank my parliamentary secretary, Gary Ananda Sangri. I am fortunate to be able to work with Gary on these issues. One story many of us like to tell ourselves is that justice is colorblind. In the criminal justice system, we know it's not. For many Black Canadians, the notion of justice evokes difficult and complicated feelings developed over a lifetime of experiences. Experiences that I, as a white Italian Canadian who grew up in Port Colborne, Ontario, have simply not had. La ministre Ien vient de dépeindre un portrait vivide de l'expérience des personnes noires avec le système de justice. Mon collègue Ahmed Hussen vient de faire la même chose. Permettez-moi d'ajouter des détails. Les personnes noires sont représentées de manière disproportionnée dans notre système de justice pénale, que ce soit en tant qu'accusé ou en tant que victime. Malgré qu'il soit environ 4% de la population, il représente 9% de la population dans les pénitenciers fédéraux en 2020-2021. C'est plus que le double. Plus tristement encore, au Canada, les personnes noires ont 4 fois plus de chances d'être victimes de meurtre que les personnes blanches. En 2020, 42% de tous les crimes haineux signalés visaient les membres des communautés noires. Black people are more likely to live in heavily policed neighborhoods, more likely to interact with law enforcement. They are less likely to be given the benefit of the doubt that I get because of the color of my skin. It's hard for many Canadians to accept this, but the truth is that racism is real and it is pervasive. It is our institutions, and it is in our institutions, and it impacts the lives of too many people. Black people face real bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious. All people in Canada should expect and receive equal treatment before the law. Yes, we've made some progress as a country. For the first time, a Black woman, Shailene Curtis McAuliffe, is Deputy Minister of Justice. A Black man, Michael Tulloch, is Chief Justice of Ontario. And there are others. Our government has made significant investments in justice for Black and racialized people, but we know that we still have a long way to go. We cannot ignore the reality that Black people in Canada experience the justice system differently than others. So what are we as a government going to do about it? Dans la lettre de mandat qu'il m'a adressé, le Premier ministre m'a demandé de travailler avec le ministre du Logement et de la Diversité et de l'Inclusion pour élaborer une stratégie en matière de justice pour les personnes noires. Aujourd'hui, j'annonce la prochaine étape de ce processus. C'est avec plaisir que j'annonce la création du groupe directeur pour la stratégie canadienne en matière de justice pour les personnes noires. Le groupe directeur offrira à notre gouvernement des conseils et des recommandations stratégiques basées sur des décennies d'expérience combinées, du travail sur le terrain, ainsi que les discussions avec d'autres experts et leaders de la communauté. Il s'agit d'un groupe de personnes extraordinaires, 9 membres qui proviennent de communautés noires de partout au Canada, tous avec une expertise et des expériences variées relativement au système de justice pénale. Donc, qu'est-ce que leur travail implique? La mission du groupe directeur est d'abord de déterminer comment réformer et moderniser le système de justice pénale. Leurs conseils et leurs avis seront au cœur de la stratégie canadienne en matière de justice pour les personnes noires. And the work begins right away. Over the coming months, the steering group will help set up the consultations in Black communities across the country. They will also sit down with experts and community leaders. They will build on the good work already done in our communities and in the justice system. What they learn will inform the strategic advice they will provide us in the form of a final report. Their advice and recommendations will guide us in developing a strategy that is grounded in the diverse histories, backgrounds, experiences, and regional realities of Black people in Canada. 2 outstanding members of the steering group are here with us today, and you will hear from them shortly. But I just want to say a bit more about these 2 extraordinary individuals. Dr. Akwasi Owusu-Bempah is a professor of sociology at the University of Toronto. His work focuses on the intersections of race, crime, and criminal justice. Zilla Jones is a criminal defense and human rights lawyer and anti-racism educator in Winnipeg. She brings over a decade of on-the-ground legal experience to the strategy. So I want to thank you both for coming here today and for taking on the role of co-writing the steering group's final report. There's a lot of responsibility in holding the pen, but it will be a positive responsibility. Your insights and experience will be invaluable. Let me thank you now and all the members of the steering group for your leadership and your dedication to this project. Our goal is to have concrete proposals for consideration by the end of this year, and we will begin implementing the Black Justice Strategy in 2024. It's an ambitious timeline, but the circumstances demand it. I know the steering group is up to the challenge. Thank you. Merci.
Merci, ministre Lametti, pour ces belles paroles très encourageantes. And now let's go and listening to 2 members of the steering committee, and I'd like to offer the floor to Dr. Akwasi Owusu-Bempah for a few words, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I think we all recognize the importance of this announcement and the work ahead. Black people in Canada have a long history of mistrust and experiences of injustice with our criminal justice systems. For as long as Black people have existed here, our legal and our justice institutions have served to oppress them. The murder of George Floyd in 2020 really opened our eyes to the presence and realities of systemic racism and anti-Black racism in particular within our society. This acknowledgement, of course, builds upon the work and the momentum and the space provided by our efforts towards truth and reconciliation. Despite our greater understanding, there is still undoubtedly much work to be done. We often hear about the overrepresentation of Black people in our correctional systems. We have decades of public reporting on Black experiences with the police in Canada. And although we have less knowledge about what happens in courts, public perceptions and the experiences of many would suggest injustice exists here too. We know that our justice system is good at punishing people, at stigmatizing them, and pushing them out beyond the mainstream of our society. All too often, our system fails to produce just outcomes. But thankfully, there are ways that we can change this. The development of Canada's Black Justice Strategy provides an opportunity to make meaningful change for Black communities that can have a positive impact for generations to come. We have the opportunity to build upon earlier work and draw upon the insights and perspectives of people from across the country. I've spent the better part of 2 decades researching our justice system, working with those impacted by it, and engaging with our core justice institutions and its representatives. We undoubtedly have a good sense of what needs to be done. We know significant changes need to be made to the way we administer justice in this country. We also need to acknowledge that we should support people outside of the formal justice system. There's a strong network of community and health and other social service organizations working adjacent to the justice system that need support and sustainable funding. Undoubtedly, we also need data to measure disparities, to measure the impact of policy and initiatives. Ultimately, what we need is a solution that recognizes commonalities and differences in our Black experience in Canada, from British Columbia and Alberta over to through Ontario, Quebec, to the Maritimes. I'm honored to be playing a key role in the development of Canada's Black Justice Strategy, and I commend this government, our Prime Minister, our Minister of Justice, and other key officials and team members in getting us to where we are today. I'd also like to recognize the vast number of people who have and will provide their input into the development of Canada's Black Justice Strategy. This work will be of benefit to future generations and ultimately for the benefit of our country. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Mr. Dr. Owusu-Bempah. And now let's go to Ms. Zilla Jones for a few words. Please, Ms. Jones.
Bonjour, good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here in Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, visiting from Treaty 1 territory in the home of the Métis Nation in Winnipeg. And I'm thrilled to be one of the authors of this Canada's Black Justice Strategy. I've been doing this work for over a decade. I think the last time I was in Ottawa was just down the street to argue a case at the Supreme Court. And being chosen to write this report feels like a culmination of my career in writing, teaching, and advocating. In February, the Black community focuses on Black History Month. And this is a time when we tell our stories. The stories that have been forgotten, the stories that we were not allowed to tell, the stories that should be shared all year and not just in 1 month. Les histoires de nos rêves, de nos espoirs, de nos réalisations. Le courage de nos ancêtres de quitter leur patrie, volontairement ou non, de voyager dans un pays étrange. Un pays qui est maintenant notre pays. Malheureusement, ces histoires sont imprégnées avec les histoires d'injustice. The first person of African descent to touch the soil of Turtle Island on this land now known as Canada is believed to be a man known as Mathieu da Costa, and he arrived in New France around 1608. Mathieu da Costa était interprète entre les Européens et les peuples autochtones. C'est important que la première personne noire au Canada a écouté et a jeté des ponts entre les personnes. Et j'écouterai aussi. J'écouterai les histoires des communautés noires d'un océan à l'autre et à l'autre. Like Mathieu da Costa, I will be listening closely to the stories I'm honored to receive. Little is known of Mathieu da Costa's life, but we do know that in 1609, he was in jail in France. We don't know why. It is one of the many mysteries about him that died with him. But it is significant that this Black man, who played such an integral role, intentionally or not, in the European colonial expansion, could not escape the criminal justice system. In Canada, as in other Western countries, the law has long been used to crush Black people's dreams of freedom. Ce n'était pas que les Noirs étaient mauvais, c'était que les Noirs étaient puissants, et la loi contrôlait notre pouvoir. Canadians have long been told the stories of how slaves left the southern United States and followed the North Star to Canada and a life free of bondage. But we didn't often hear the stories of how Canada all too often cooperated with fugitive slave laws to return runaways to their so-called owners, or how the refugees often struggled to settle in Canada, victims of racism and segregation, and many eventually chose to return south of the border to what they thought would be a better life in the northern Free States. There were laws in this country that codified slavery. There were laws that codified segregation, such as the law that Viola Desmond famously resisted in Nova Scotia. There were laws restricting immigration to Canada by Black people. We're in the John A. Macdonald building. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald famously stated that he did not want Black people in Canada at all. Anti-Black racism has always been part of the law in Canada. Marie-Joseph Angélique a été accusée d'avoir incendié la ville de Montréal en 1734 et elle a été torturée à mort après un procès dans lequel elle n'a jamais eu la chance. Mais le changement est possible. Le gouvernement du Canada et le département de justice ont écouté. In my criminal law practice, I represent many African Canadian people and I hear their stories. Their 18-year-old son was wrongly pulled over by police, their car windows smashed, the young person traumatized. Their 21-year-old daughter carried drugs for her abusive, older gang-involved boyfriend. Their 19-year-old son sold drugs when he was desperate for cash. They sit in my office, these young people, or their mothers, their fathers, their grandmothers, their grandfathers, and they ask me, are there options? Do they have to go to jail, to the penitentiary? How soon will they get parole? They are very disappointed when they learn that I, the prosecutor, and the judge are all bound by Canadian law, by mandatory minimums, by sentencing ranges. Currently, the Canadian bail system is being demonized for political points. And those who seek to stoke division say that it is too easy to get bail. But the reality is that for African Canadians, bail and parole and sentencing have too long been unjust and too harsh, with disproportionate effects upon our communities. Pendant trop longtemps, nous avons été trop surveillés et trop punis. Et maintenant, notre gouvernement a réalisé que ça ne marche pas. Our government has made a commitment to develop a Black justice strategy that seeks to eliminate these disparities and to find a new way that offers accountability and hope. I'm honored to be a part of this strategy which centers Black communities, which will listen to Black communities, which will empower Black communities. En tant que mère, j'espère que mes fils en hériteront un monde meilleur. I hope all our children inherit a better world. I hope that we can honor the spirits of Matilda Costa, and Marie-Joseph Angélique, and Viola Desmond, and all of our ancestors as we move forward with Canada's Black Justice Strategy. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jones. And I'd like to thank all four of you, five of you, because it was really amazing to listen to your speeches. Et un merci spécial à mon collègue David Lametti pour nous avoir écoutés et surtout pour prendre action en justice pour les Noirs ici. Et je peux vous dire que je veux souhaiter du succès au groupe de travail, mais en tant que grand-père de 2 petites filles et père de 2 jeunes garçons adultes, eh bien, cette stratégie me donne énormément d'espoir. Donc, merci à vous pour le travail que vous faites. So now, we will begin the question and answer period. Et nous allons maintenant amorcer la période de questions et de réponses. À vous, les journalistes.
Merci beaucoup. So if you're attending on Zoom and you have a question, please use the raise hand function at this time. But first, Annie Bergeron, Oliver in the room, over to you.
Hi, I'm not sure who wants to answer it, but I'm just curious to know how this strategy will help to find ways to get more Black judges on the bench, and what types of barriers need to be removed to ensure that that can happen and to ensure that Black prosecutors don't face systemic racism throughout the system.
Happy to try first, and then at least on the judicial appointments part, and then allow anyone else to jump in if they want, Annie. We have to build trust in the community in order to get more people to apply to the bench. I've been working at that. It's taken a while. I think it's starting to bear fruit across Canada. Some places better than others. But people, what I heard at the outset was, well, there's no point applying. You'll never appoint me. And so Jody Wilson-Raybould set up a system. I have taken that system on, modified it, tweaked it a little bit, but have done a lot of outreach in order to try to build that trust. But we also have to inspect the system, too, to find where there are instances of systemic discrimination within the system. I was speaking to South Asian lawyers in Vancouver early in my mandate, and they said, well, the fact that we have to name a judge, we practice within our community. We do a lot of contract work, a lot of so-called solicitors work. The fact that we have to name a judge as a reference, we never come into contact with judges. So that presents a barrier. We've changed that. can be a senior member of the bar now. But are there other instances? And so people with lived experiences like Zilla are going to be able, and working with other experts across the country, are going to be able to identify other barriers that might exist in the nomination process. And I'll turn it over perhaps to Zilla, and you've got experience in the criminal bench.
As a lawyer on the ground doing criminal defense, this topic definitely comes up. And I know for myself personally, I do feel those barriers that, well, I'll never be a judge. Like, they'll never appoint me. Like, I'm too different or too outspoken or, you know, there's certain, I think, perceptions of what a judge is and who a judge is, and I don't feel I fit that. So there's definitely that overcoming that. I don't know if it's mistrust, but certainly a sense of just not belonging and not being good enough or not being ready to be a judge. And I think the process can be intimidating as well. The application process, from the little I know of it, is quite intensive, and is the perception they dig into your life and anything you may have said or done. And once you're judged, you'll be muzzled and you can't be part of your community anymore and you can't speak out in the way that I just did. So you're giving up parts of your life to be a judge, and is that really what you want? So I definitely think that there's a need for conversation and bridge building, and it may be that it's actually not as intimidating and scary as it sounds like, and I think outreach to lawyers of color, racialized lawyers, would go a long way in helping to remedy that, because I definitely notice in practice that I don't appear before racialized judges very much at all in Manitoba. In fact, I can't think of, there's a few Indigenous judges, I think, but they're very few and far between. So the clients are not seeing judges that look like them, they're not seeing lawyers that look like them, they're not seeing prosecutors that look like them. And I think that contributes to their feeling of alienation, which then we also feel. So I hope this strategy will look at ways to fix that.
Okay, and I guess a follow-up then. You talked a lot about police forces over-surveilling Black communities. I'm wondering how this strategy will help address that, especially given that a lot of that is sort of more provincial and city work. So how do you intend to work with different police forces, and is that going to be sort of one of the top priorities for the strategy when it's implemented in 2024?
Well, I won't prejudge the work of the committee, but it is something that will be a priority. There's simply no question that policing, and so I'll work with my colleague at the federal level, Marco Mendocino, but also our provincial and territorial colleagues, as well as community groups and others, and we'll look at what the steering committee does and where they point us, where their experience and their knowledge points us. And then these kinds of challenges are going to require collective solutions. They're going to require sustained effort and sustained resources to attack the problem, address the problem. And I'm committing to do whatever it takes with whomever it takes in order to get this done.
And if I can add to that as well, obviously a lot of the policing that affects Black people takes place at the municipal and the provincial level. But that doesn't mean that we can't identify strategies for municipal and provincial police forces to implement that's outside of the actual remit of the Department of Justice or other federal departments, but set a series of best practices and priorities for those agencies to follow.
What's so insidious about policing is that it's often the matters that don't necessarily come before the courts that harm people. So, for instance, Minister Hussen talked about being stopped by police and questioned. You don't necessarily get a charge from that. But it's the psychological impact as someone with young sons that are growing up and knowing that you have to have that conversation with them about what to do when you're stopped, and don't make sure they can see your hands and don't make any sudden movements, and that mothers have to tell our sons these things. And this is a good kid over here, I'm assuming, and my kids are good kids, and yet they still have to deal with this. So that is a difficult part, is that there's a lot of discretion, there's a lot of sort of on the ground decision making that you're not going to capture in the criminal code, but it's really a culture shift in policing and just looking at it differently. And that, I think, is a challenge, but it's certainly something we need to be open to.
The other thing is, if I may just add, again, I wouldn't dare prejudge the work of the committee, but I think one of the things that I hope we all take from this effort and looking at the need is, I'm working on a national action plan to combat hate. One of the things that really floored me is to understand, for example, speaking of the court-related issues that really affect Black Canadians and other racialized communities in Canada is that we don't have a standard. We don't have a common standard, a reliable standard on the reporting of hate crimes. So when you report a hate crime, when a Black Canadian individual experiences hate or hate-motivated violence, it really depends where in the country you're in and which police force you report to. There's so many variations in the range of responses in that report. The other pieces you talked about, you know, the judiciary and the bench and Black judges and prosecutors, it starts earlier than that. In law schools, law schools have to do better in this country. I remember arriving at the University of Ottawa and looking at the year ahead of me, and there was only one Black gentleman, and then I was the only one. And this is one of the schools that prides itself on social justice. So when Minister Lametti talks about a whole of society approach, we got to do better. And local police forces have to do better. They have to do community policing. They have to treat people with respect. But, you know, we can talk about the bench, but it goes further than that. Why are young Black Canadians not applying to law schools in the numbers that we would expect them to? What is it about those institutions that they don't feel welcomed or embraced by? And then, you know, reporting of hate crimes. How do people navigate the criminal justice system when they suffer hate or hate-motivated violence? So we got to look at the entire system and not just the judiciary particularly. Although, as a lawyer, I can tell you, in my previous role practicing, I would walk into courtrooms where everyone except the accused and myself didn't look like me. And so what does that do to the psychology of young Black Canadians in this country? So I think it's not just the culture of these institutions, but it's a really critical rethink and culture shift in the way we do business in Canada to make sure that we incorporate the lives and the lived reality and the experiences of far too many of our citizens. And if we're not prepared to do that, these systemic disproportional issues will continue to affect us.
If I might just add something to what Minister Hussen is saying, and Zilla, what you were saying, it's the stories we don't tell. And interestingly enough, you know, Black History Month, the theme is ours to tell. And it's the ones that we don't. It's the ones that we have at our dinner tables, and we speak about amongst ourselves. People might refer to those as microaggressions. They're all macro. There's a toll to pay. And there is trauma as well. And so when we see kids not applying to law school, when there are police stops, and I have to say, I wrote about one where I was stopped in my own driveway, right? And the lesson learned there, so many people said, well, you know, it wasn't racism, what's the problem? What people don't understand is the trauma, because I have seen throughout my life friends in my own community stopped. My father, brother-in-law, boyfriends. I've been a part of so many things. I grew up in Scarborough, Ontario. And so to be stopped as a Black person, there's a level of trauma that you're already carrying. And that's where those conversations that Zilla talked about and I referred to that we have with our children, my son's 11, but I had a conversation with him 3 years ago, not about whether or not he will be stopped by police, but what to do when he is. That's the reality. Dash, you will drive one day. When you're stopped, make sure both hands are on the wheel. Make sure you're not reaching for anything, Dash. Make sure you're not reaching for identification. Make sure you have it already in your lap. Maintain eye contact. Those are the kinds of conversations that Black mothers and fathers have with their kids. Systems aren't broken. Our systems, rather, aren't fixed overnight, in particular broken ones, but this is a heck of a step.
Merci. Passons sur Zoom. Mélanie Marquis, La Presse.
Bonjour, je m'excuse, je vais poser une question sur un autre sujet pour M. Lametti. Un peu plus tôt, l'Assemblée nationale vous a demandé dans une motion de modifier la loi C5 parce que, entre autres, ce qu'on dit dans la motion, c'est que Ottawa vient infliger, je cite, un recul en matière de lutte contre les violences sexuelles, fin de la citation. Je voulais savoir comment vous réagissez à ça, s'il est question peut-être de modifier C5. Merci.
Merci, Mélanie, pour la question. C5 vient d'être promulgué, donc je crois qu'on doit pas avoir des réactions trop fortes au début. Je suis fier de C5. Le but de C5 était justement de combattre la surreprésentation des personnes noires et autochtones dans le système carcéral. Et donc, il y a des mesures très positives. Pour les agressions sexuelles, les crimes graves méritent des conséquences graves et on laisse évidemment une certaine discrétion à un juge au moment de la peine de déterminer les faits et les peines selon les circonstances. Mais en tant que gouvernement, nous avons fait plus que n'importe quel autre gouvernement dans l'histoire canadienne pour appuyer et soutenir les victimes de la violence sexuelle pour améliorer la loi avec l'ancien projet de loi C-51, avec C3 pour la formation des juges et d'autres mesures de soutien pour les victimes d'agressions sexuelles. Je crois que ces mesures vont porter fruit avec le temps et on est là de tout cœur avec les victimes d'agressions sexuelles. C'est sérieux comme situation. Et les crimes graves méritent des conséquences graves.
Et c'est important de se souvenir que les victimes souvent sont des accusés et les accusés sont des victimes. C'est les mêmes personnes.
Follow-up, Mélanie?
Oui, je m'excuse, j'avais désactivé mon son. Juste, M. Lametti, pour préciser, est-ce que vous êtes ouvert peut-être à modifier la loi pour rendre inadmissible l'infraction d'agression sexuelle aux peines d'emprisonnement dans la collectivité? Puis, sur un autre sujet aussi, il y a Mme Loki, la commissaire de la GRC, qui annonce sa démission. Quel bilan faites-vous de son passage à la tête de la GRC?
Merci encore, Mélanie, pour les deux questions. Donc, d'abord, comme j'ai dit, C5 vient d'être promulgué. Évidemment, on surveille en tout temps la mise en œuvre d'une loi. On va continuer. Mais comme je viens de dire, une partie importante, une partie clé de notre système, c'est la discrétion qu'on donne aux juges au moment de la peine. Il y a des bonnes raisons pour avoir réduit le nombre de peines minimales obligatoires dans le système. Il y a des bonnes raisons pour avoir redonné le pouvoir de donner des ordonnances sur sursis à un juge au moment de la termination de la peine. La sécurité publique n'est pas... c'est utilisable, c'est un choix uniquement quand la peine aura été moins de 2 ans et que la sécurité publique n'est pas menacée. Et on laisse une certaine marge de manœuvre à nos juges pour déterminer, selon la preuve, selon les arguments des procureurs et des avocats de la défense. Et c'est une partie clé de notre système. Comme j'ai dit, le but de C5, c'était de combattre la surreprésentation des personnes noires et autochtones dans le système de justice. Et on veut... Il y a un grand défi, comme vous venez d'entendre encore une fois cet après-midi. Et pour les agressions sexuelles, ce qu'on a toujours dit, les crimes graves méritent les conséquences graves. Et donc, pour l'instant, on va surveiller la mise en œuvre de la loi. Pour Mme Lucky, je voudrais la remercier pour son service rendu au pays. C'était une nomination historique pour la GRC et j'ai servi avec elle sur des situations difficiles, je dois avouer, et donc je la remercie pour son service. would like to thank Commissioner Lucky for her service as Commissioner of the RCMP. It was a historic appointment. We have served through some very challenging times together, and I appreciate even more her service.
Next up, Stephen Huff, CBC.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my questions. This is for Minister Lametti, but if anyone else on the panel wants to weigh in, I'd like to hear them. Minister Lametti, what do you think Brenda Lucky's legacy will be?
Look, I'm not the minister in charge, and it's Minister Mendicino, the Minister of Public Security. Certainly, it was a historic appointment, and I know that she made efforts to reform the RCMP, and to even address some of the issues that we're talking about today. So, a historic first step, and again, she deserves to be thanked for her service.
And as a follow-up, in light of the issues you're looking at today, what do you think the next commissioner should embody, or some of the issues the next commissioner should shape the choice around the next commissioner?
I think I would rather leave that answer to Minister Mendicino. I think generally as a government, we have in our nomination processes, in our appointment processes, sought quality and diversity. Leadership. We want our appointments to reflect the diversity of Canada, and we want them to be highly qualified, competent individuals to perform the very important roles that Canadians expect them to perform, and I hope that we'll move also in that direction.
Thank you so much for taking my questions.
Just because it relates to something that was being said about appointments to the bench as well, I think it's important not only for the individual to reflect the diversity of the country, but also to understand and comprehend the diversity of the country. Because representation is one thing, but a core understanding of, again, this vastly diverse country in terms of geographical differences, but also racial, ethnic, religious, and cultural differences, from my perspective, is key in someone who's expected to lead a federal police force.
And I think the culture of the institution is always the most important. I think recent events south of the border have shown that the color of your skin does not necessarily make you more sympathetic or doing your job any differently. So certainly representation matters, but I agree with my colleague that it's representation of what? So not just the external, but also the internal.
Now, Adrian Gabriel, CTV.
Hi, good afternoon. A question for Minister Lametti. Today, the Cannabis Council of Canada, as well as producers from across the country, came to Parliament Hill to plead with the federal government to act now and amend Canada's current legislation around recreational cannabis. With the closure of one of the biggest facilities in the country last week by Canopy Growth, many say that they can't wait for the Cannabis Act to be reformed. They say the legislation needs to be fixed now, and the safety of cannabis in the country is paramount to having a robust, regulated market. Is your government working at all to address some of these concerns in the short term?
There is a cannabis review. The law pertaining to cannabis legalization has a review built into it, and my understanding is that review will take place. And this is precisely the kind of issue that will be studied. Certainly, we're listening to voices and experts in the community, and hopefully that will inform the manner and substance of the review.
Just to follow up, they're saying that the industry can't wait for the review to be completed. It's already. It's supposed to be, it's a year late already on the Cannabis Act review. And they say to protect the health and safety of Canadians, which is paramount to the Cannabis Act, that changes need to be made immediately to help the regulated market. Why hasn't the Liberal government done anything up until now to help the regulated industry combat the illegal market?
Well, I think one of the successes of the legislation was to replace a significant portion of the illegal market. But again, the review was built into the legislation for precisely this purpose. And my understanding is that the review will happen in due course.
I see no more hands on Zoom, so I believe that puts an end to this press conference. Merci beaucoup à tous les ministres et à tous les invités.